All right. So I appreciate you all joining us tonight. Again, my name is Mallory Henry. I'm a senior coordinator of student assistant services and education for Caron Treatment Centers. Been with Caron about 11 years. Prior to Caron, I did in-home family-based mental health counseling, and my undergrad was in secondary education. So I kind of have like a education, mental health, behavioral health background. And tonight we're going to talk about the sibling story. So as well as being a person who works at Caron Treatment Centers, I am the sibling of a person in recovery, someone who suffers from a substance use disorder. So I'm super passionate about working with siblings. And so I'll kind of talk about how this kind of came to fruition. But the sibling story is something I'm really passionate about sharing. I'm really passionate about working with siblings and talking about the impact that not only substance use disorder, but any illness, disease, disorder of a sibling, how that impacts the rest of the family, specifically other children in the family. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today for an hour. I really want to look at this kind of as like the tip of the iceberg in terms of this. I mean, this is only an hour. I could talk about impact on siblings probably for hours and hours and hours. But the hope is that we can continue this conversation as we move into the future, because this is obviously a need. It's obviously something that needs to be talked about. So for those of you who just jumped on, this presentation is being delivered through Caron Treatment Centers and an organization called Students Recover, which is a virtual platform. Caron Treatment Centers is mostly known as a drug and alcohol treatment facility. And we really are partnering in this endeavor to work with siblings because, again, we see the importance of this, and we have a larger reach together than we would individually. So what we're going to talk about tonight, I want to discuss the concept of a family disease and what that means. I think we've done a decent job, of talking about substance use disorder as a family disease, and I'll talk more about that. But when I started to do research on how siblings were impacted by substance use disorder, what I realized was I was talking to a lot of siblings that said, you know, I'm impacted by something that's not a substance use disorder, but the impact you're talking about that you felt because of your sibling's substance use disorder is really similar to what I've felt when, you know, a sibling suffered from something else. So I started to think, you know, this isn't just about substance use disorder. This is about really anything and anything that can affect our family, you know, in general, and what that family system looks like. So we'll discuss some ways that siblings specifically are affected. And then what I really want to finish with is learn how to cope and find our own personal recovery. I'm really big into talking about recovery and what that means for individuals in a family system, what family recovery looks like, but also what individual recovery looks like, especially when you're not necessarily the one who might be struggling, but are impacted by someone's struggle, and what recovery means in that sense. So I'm going to start here with the definition of a family. And I like this definition because I think we all are coming to the table with a definition of family that might not match what someone else's definition of family is, and that's okay. But I'm looking at family as a term in a broad sense. So family is a circle of care and support, offering enduring commitment to care for one another, related either biologically, emotionally, or legally, and takes into account those who the client identifies as significant to his or her well-being. So I think a lot of times people grow up with, you know, different definitions of family. For some people, family is blood, family lives in the home. That is my definition of family. For some people, family is a larger scale. It's people that I am emotionally connected to, people that are significant to me in my life, and they might not be blood or genetically related to me. I grew up in a family where I had aunts and uncles who I didn't realize were not actually biological, genetically aunts and uncles until I was in my 20s. But that's, you know, my parents had very, very close friendships. And I looked at them as aunts and uncles and cousins and things like that, even though they weren't necessarily related to me. So for me, definition has a broader sense. So when I look at family, I want you to think about what your definition of family is, but also maybe what other people's definition of families is, and know that it could be different for all of us, and that's okay. Because sometimes people will say, well, the person that, you know, I'm affected by is not my family, so it shouldn't be that big of a deal, right? But what I say is, if that person is significant to you, of course it's going to impact you. You don't have to be blood related to that person. So I want to talk about what a family disease means. We talked a little bit about family, but let's talk about what a family disease could mean. When I look at an individual, what I look at is kind of understanding the relationship within the broader system. So when I look at family systems theory, which is really what my focus was when I was doing family-based, is really kind of this theory of human behavior that defines family as kind of this complex social system, so that we all interact with each other, and family members are interconnected, right? So if we see it as a larger system, it helps us kind of see how it's working. So any change within one part of the system is likely to influence the other parts of the system, right? So what I look at it is kind of like a gear. This is the visual I have in my head, right? We are all kind of gears in a family system. And when one of us spins, the rest of us spin. And sometimes those patterns can be healthy. Sometimes those patterns can be unhealthy. But regardless, we are interconnected within our family system, all right? And again, it's whatever that definition of family is for you. So if one of these gears starts turning the other direction or stops, it's going to impact the other gears, even though they're technically separate entities. And that's what I kind of think of when I think of a disease that affects the family. So when I'm talking about a disease that affects the family, it could be anything. I'm talking about substance use disorder, right? That's what I'm bringing to the table. I'm the sibling of a person who struggles with substance use disorder, currently in long-term recovery, still impacted and still a family working towards recovery. I have friends who have siblings who have mental illness. I have friends who have a brother who had a significant stroke when he was a teenager, and there was a lot of rehabilitation that went with that. And so when I kind of go through the rest of this presentation, I bring in quotes from other people that I surveyed related to how they were impacted by a sibling's disease, illness, whatever. You can kind of put whatever you want in that quotes. Because I don't want to put a definition on what that can or can't be, because it really could be anything for any family. I do like to own my privilege in this, that I am a white heterosexual cis female. So I, had privilege to have access to platforms and resources that I know that others do not. So I also like to make sure that I'm bringing in as many other voices as I can to this. So you'll see that as I give quotes throughout, so that I can bring another voice that's not just mine to the table. So in terms of what does a struggling family look like, right? On the outside, there's no discrimination between a family that could be struggling, right? It's a full range of socioeconomic status, any race or ethnicity, any religion, any cultural background. It could be a very close connected family to a divorced, separated family, a family that never married, again, a family that, is blood related versus a family that's a larger system. These concerns, this family disease, they don't discriminate, right? It doesn't necessarily matter what that family looks like on the outside. But what we know is on the inside, when that there is a struggle from someone in that gear system, that one gear is not functioning the way it should, is that some of the families could look like this. It could look chaotic and unpredictable, right? I don't know what I'm going to get tomorrow. I don't know how this person's going to be tomorrow. I don't know if they're going to feel good or feel sick. I don't know if they're going to be using substances or not. I don't know if they're going to have a doctor's appointment or not, right? It's unpredictable, and it can be chaotic. For some families, there's an unspoken rule of this stays in the family, right? We don't talk about it outside of the family. We don't want other people to know, right? I always joke about my family, and that was kind of an unspoken rule, is like, that is not something we share outside of this family. So when someone's struggling, it's only something we talk about internally. My grandma actually had a sign above her door when I was a kid that said, like, put a little lipstick on and you'll be fine. And I often think about that, because like, if we just put this mask on when we leave our house, it'll be like everyone thinks that the family's normal, that everything is normal, right? So it kind of stays in that internal system. For some families, we might see siblings feeling like needing to grow up faster, might take on a parentified role. They might need to care for other siblings. They might need to care for younger siblings. They might take on more responsibilities in the home, helping a younger sibling with homework, doing cooking dinner, driving family members to certain appointments or classes or extracurricular activities, things like that. And sometimes we also see family members engaged in exhausting efforts to rescue the person. And that rescue could look like anything. When I say rescue, there's no shame in that word for me. Rescue could be trying to keep another child alive, right? And that is a valid rescue. But that doesn't mean that attention being given to a child who needs it doesn't mean that there's not other children in the home potentially who aren't being able to then receive the attention maybe they also need or need in a different way. Right? So let's talk a little bit about how this looks specifically for siblings. I know a lot of people had reached out, and I even see some things coming into the chat to me specifically saying, this is the first time I've heard someone talk about the impact of siblings. So that leads me to believe we need to do more of this, right? That this is super important. So let's look at just some things. I like to start my presentations with this poem. This poem was sent to me by a family support group for families who have substance use disorder in it. And the leader of the family support group has a sibling in a child in recovery and another child. And I was talking to that other child, and she said, I found this poem and I'm going to send it to you because I've never felt like someone knew me as much as I did when I read this poem. And when she sent this to me, and even to this day when I read it, it hits so close to home to me because it's almost 100% how I felt. And even to this day, I still continue to feel occasionally having a brother who suffers. So I am the other child, the okay one. I'm the sober child, the one on the sidelines. I am the observer, the one watching him slowly killing our parents. I'm the angry one, the one who's pissed because he's destroying our family. I'm the sad one, the one losing her best friend. I am the reassuring one, the one holding her mama as she cries. I am the torn one, the broken one trying to hold everyone together. I am the confused one, the one who wonders how we became so unimportant and invisible. I am the other child, the okay one. Right? So this is specifically about a sibling who has a substance use disorder. However, I really think this can pertain to pretty much anything if you think about it. It doesn't have to be a substance use disorder, right? It could just be I'm the child that doesn't suffer from this. Right? I am the child who's watching my parents, give a lot of attention to this person, right? I might feel invisible regardless of what the sibling's dealing with, okay? And I will share, I will send the recording. I will also put the PowerPoint in there so you guys can have this if you want to see it as well, okay? Or share it or do whatever you want, please. I'm all about sharing resources. So when we talk about impact on siblings, I'm going to kind of break it up into a couple of categories. But really, when I look at this, I'm looking at a family that I say is beyond bandwidth, right? When there is a sick person in a family system, right, a lot of attention, resources go to that person, right? An analogy I've used before is like a family also is like on a boat. And if someone goes overboard, right, everyone's going to the edge of that. Some parents are jumping into the water, treading water with that other child to help keep them afloat, to keep them from drowning, or they're looking, right, from the side. And there's other children then that are either going to the side as well, jumping in the water as well, or in the back saying, hey, what about me, right? Or doing all three of those things at any given point, right? So it is a family that's at bandwidth. Right? Everyone is giving all of their time and resources because someone needs it, right? Which means that the other children in the home, right, whether they're in the home or not, but the other siblings, the other people who are impacted, right, could have unmet developmental needs, could have impaired attachments, could feel underappreciated or overlooked, could also be emotionally spent, but yet not in crisis. So maybe not seeming that they have emotional distress, but yet do. Could have divided allegiances and guilt, right? Do I side with my parents? Do I side with my sibling, right? What do I do in this situation? We could see parentification. Again, children who maybe take on more parental roles within the home, a lack of attention for the other siblings, and family resources and energy that might already be overspent. So I'm going to break these down a little bit more, but this is kind of an overview. So let's start with financial impact. And again, some of these will relate to some situations and some might not. If there's substance use disorder or even a mental health concern in the home, sometimes we'll see stealing of money. I know that when my brother was in his active addiction, stealing was something that often impacted me and my family. I know that sometimes if I was to go home to my parents' house, my brother suffered from his addiction at the highest point when he was in high school and I was in college. So I didn't live in the home with him at the time. But I remember going home and I would not bring my purse in the house. I would leave it in the car because I was very, very fearful that he would get into my stuff or steal from me. So stealing. Treatment, medical care, and medication is very expensive, right? So I know that when my brother needed treatment, my parents had to take out significant loans, use all of our insurance deductible, use money they had in savings in order to help my brother seek treatment, which then meant that there was less money to be utilized on me, right? And again, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying that was an impact that happened to me, right? Attorney fees, court costs, legal fees, if there's anything related to the legal system, or even fighting insurance to cover certain things, right? There's fees and time and money that go with those things, which means, again, less finances for everyone else in the home. Right? Potentially fixing or replacing property or cars, supporting a patient and or patient's children. So I say patient as the person who's struggling. So I've worked with a lot of families who parents might be caring for grandchildren. So of the person who's suffering's children, or they're just supporting financially, paying for a house, paying for a car, continuing to support financially, even potentially when they don't necessarily need it. And that means that opportunities for the sibling could potentially have been or be reduced. Opportunities for education. I know that my parents, when I was in college, my parents, again, very privileged, were going to pay for me to go to college. 1 year into my college education, my brother needed treatment. And my parents said to me, we need to use the money that we had saved for you to go to college to send your brother to treatment. Which meant I had to take out loans to pay for my college. So there was a significant financial impact on me, and still a financial impact on me in terms of school debt because of needing to utilize money for my sibling. Maybe less opportunities for hobbies, right? Hobbies can be expensive, sports can be expensive, those types of things. A lack of opportunities for vacation. So if funding is being sent over here for a sibling for whatever, there might be less opportunities to go on vacation, to travel, to do those things. And just life in general, there might be less financial help for the siblings when money and resources and time and energy are going somewhere else. So I'm going to, again, use some quotes here for people that are not my voice, but people who have been impacted, whether that's through substance use, mental illness, some other disease or impact in the family. So the first quote says, I never conveyed my internal struggle with losing the emotional connection with my sibling and the pain it caused me when I couldn't trust my own sibling. For example, the fear of him selling my belongings for money for drugs. I looked at him as a threat for a while in that way when I had to hide or lock away my personal belongings when I was around him. This other person wrote, there was a lot of lying, stealing, manipulation, right? So we see two people here talking about how financially stealing had been really impactful for them and what that meant for them. And this person specifically talking about what that internal struggle was like to not trust a sibling, right? There's a lot of trauma that comes with that because a sibling is a person we are supposed to innately trust. And then to have that dynamic change can be really traumatic. So I like to talk about the physical impact because I do think this is one that sometimes doesn't, I don't think a lot of these get attention, but I do think physical impact gets least amount of attention. But when I work with families, specifically siblings, one of the things I hear a lot is that they struggle with their own physical health. We'll talk about mental health, but they talk a lot of times their own physical health suffers. I see a lot of, trauma-related responses with headaches, migraines, stomach issues, GI issues, a lot of medical conditions that we know are exacerbated by stress, right? Or an increased stress in our own or family system. Exhaustion, insomnia, not being able to sleep, not being able to stay asleep, worrying about our sibling, worrying about our parents, worrying about our family, can lead to a lot of sleep disorder, right? Violence and threats, specifically if there's substance use disorder, right? Not necessarily feeling safe in your own home, right? Not knowing what's going to come home that day. Am I going to feel safe if am I not? I know that sometimes with substance use disorder, things can get physical very quickly because people aren't in sound mind, and morally they're not where they would like to be when they're clean and sober, right? So sometimes we see violence in homes, and that lack of safety can have significant physical impacts. Sometimes we see routine medical care being overlooked because of, again, a hyper focus, right? If we have parents who are hyper focused on a child who's very, very sick with whatever that might be, they might, forget that you have a dentist appointment. They might forget that you need a physical for school, right? We might have routine medical care just overlooked, again, because we see that attention being given to someone else. So here is another quote. I felt alone a lot. I felt ignored a lot. I felt like I had to be quiet and perfect and funny and positive to make up for everything else that was going on. I couldn't need anything because she was occupying all of their, meaning parents, time and energy. Okay? So I know when I read this quote, I was like, yeah, that hits the nail on the head, right? Of feeling the need to not need anything, to do it all myself, to be perfect, because I couldn't be another burden on my parents, right? They were already struggling with my brother. I couldn't possibly need anything because there wasn't any bandwidth left, right? And I knew that my brother, quote unquote, and I'm going to put it in quotes, at the time I thought needed them more than I did. Right? And I don't think that's necessarily true now, but at that time, that is what I thought, right? And there's no way that I could ask for help because I don't want to burden them who they're already struggling with a brother who really, really needs them, right? My sibling really needed them. So a question I asked was, how have your siblings, and I'm putting issue in quotes. I don't like that word, but I wanted to make it broad enough that it could be, again, anything. So asking how it physically affected your life. And you can see here that stress and anxiety came up. Almost every person that I polled, right? Stress, anxiety, chaos, the anxiety and the stress that comes with that, the added stress. Obviously, increased stress has tolls on our emotional health, but it also has significant tolls on our physical health, right? And a lot of times we don't talk about those, but stress is really dangerous and damaging for our bodies physically. So in terms of the emotional impact, we see anxiety, right? I see a lot of anxiety and anxious behavior with siblings, right? Because they're worried, they're concerned, they don't know what to expect. It's unpredictable, right? Anxiety is a natural response to that. But when it happens over and over and over and chronically, right? We might be worried for a patient's health, well-being, right? We're scared, we're fearful. There can be guilt for setting limits, setting a boundary around that person, right? Saying, I can't necessarily have this conversation with you right now. I'm not in a place to have a relationship with you right now, I know is sometimes, a boundary that needs to be set. And that's a lot of guilt, right? How do I set a boundary around someone that I love so much? That is supposed to be my, best friend when they're born. Emotional numbing from living in a constant crisis, right? So our own dissociation, right? Of picking up maybe our own unhealthy coping skills to deal with the constant crisis and stress that is going on in our family. And then we do see trauma-like symptoms, right? Hyperarousal, that unpredictability of what's going to happen, that fight or flight response, that fight, flight, or freeze kind of going off all the time, that hypervigilance around, who is the person that's going to walk in the door? Is my sibling going to be okay today? Is something going to happen? When is the other shoe going to drop, so to say? If things are going well, sometimes that's even worse sometimes for families, because I'll hear siblings say, like, I'm just waiting for something bad to happen. Right. And that has significant emotional toll on us as well. And when you pair that, I think, with siblings who feel like I can't burden my parents with my own stuff, especially when my own feelings are stemming from a sibling, there is such immense shame and guilt that come with that, right? My brother, I used to think all the time, like, my brother needs my parents so much because he needs them to survive, right? He needs them to help get him connected to treatment. He needs them to give him that attention. But I was struggling with my own anxiety and my own feelings of how that was impacting me. And very much so felt like I couldn't tell my parents that because I did not want to burden them. And I didn't want to blame my brother, right? And I didn't want to blame my parents. I didn't want them to feel guilt and shame, who in turn had a lot of guilt and shame on me. So here are some quotes. I'm a caretaker, right? I have to worry every day. As the sibling, I'm just always trying to keep everyone happy. Not getting my needs met caused my own mental illness, my own depression and anxiety. So here we have siblings saying that growing up in that situation, or even being an adult in that situation, significantly impacted my own mental health as well. So some invisible impacts, I think some, again, ones we don't necessarily talk about that I hear a lot from siblings, the impact of what that change in relationship is like. I know when I talk to a lot of siblings, they'll say like, my sibling was my best friend and then that changed. Right? Or my sibling and I were so close and then they weren't, right? Or they weren't the same person, or something happened that made them really sick. And the dynamic just changed, right? And that relationship shifted. And there's a loss and a grieving process that goes with that I don't think we always acknowledge. Sometimes with siblings, there is a piece of who to have allegiance to. I know when I work with families with substance use disorder, a lot of times I hear siblings say to me, I don't necessarily agree with how my parents are parenting my sibling. So I don't know who to have allegiance to. Or my sibling has said, don't tell mom and dad, right, that this is happening. And do I not tell mom and dad, or do I? So who do I have allegiance to, my parents or my sibling, right? And I don't know where to go from that. Strains on the parent-child relationship. There can be significant impacts and potential damage on the relationship of the siblings with their own parents. I know that I talk about myself as a person, in a family that's working through recovery, because that is something we've had to do a lot of work on, is not only my relationship with my brother, but also my relationship with my parents and how my brother's substance use disorder impacted not only our family, but my relationship with my parents as well, and what that looks like. Again, guilt and shame. This is an incredibly shameful experience to have something in your family. And one of the reasons I think I hear that we don't talk about this is because of the shame. And one of the reasons I'm so passionate about talking about it is because vulnerability and sharing allows you to let go of some of that shame, to say, just because a person was sick, a person needed help, doesn't mean we should have shame associated with that. But we hold a lot of shame in our families from things like this. Could downplay your own successes. You saw that one of the siblings said, I needed to be perfect, right? I had a sibling once tell me that I didn't tell my parents when I was doing really well because it really upset my sibling. Right? They would say oh, you're just perfect. You're always this perfect child. And I continue to screw up. So she was telling me, I just didn't tell my parents anymore. I just wouldn't tell them when I got good grades. I didn't tell them when I got into the college I wanted to go to. I just kept it to myself. So I downplayed my own success in that. I think another thing we don't necessarily talk about all the time is knowing that genetics are going to impact our future potential families if we choose. So I know that, substance use disorder runs in my family system. So I knew that when I chose to have children, I knew that there was a genetic predisposition to substance use disorder. So that impacted my thoughts and desires potentially to have children because of those genetics. I have a very good friend who had a sister with autism growing up. And I remember we had a lot of conversations of her saying to me, I'm not sure I want to have kids because I don't know if I can bear the burden that my parents did. of my sibling growing up nonverbal and what that looks like, and the care that they had to give. And I know, that could potentially be me if I have children. So I think something we don't talk about is the longevity of that and the heaviness of that in the decision making that comes with potentially furthering your own family if you choose. And again, how this impacts your relationships as well, right? I'm talking about you as a sibling. So this impacts relationships because when there's a trauma, right? When there's trauma in the family, when there's a trauma response, right? That's going to impact relationships we have with others outside of our family. Oftentimes I talk about, so when my brother was in active addiction, I was in a very unhealthy relationship, a dating relationship, because I didn't know how to trust. I didn't know what healthy family systems looked like because I wasn't in one. I didn't know what trauma was in relationships, right? Because my family was sick at the time, and we weren't in a space to know what a trusting, loving, vulnerable, honest relationship looks like because we were sick. And we needed to figure out what that looked like. So it impacts our relationships outside of the family too, and I don't think we always talk about that either. So I know I see some people sending things in the chat that say like, yes, 100%, this is how I feel. I just want to talk a little bit about what you can do. What does recovery look like for you? What does family recovery look like? What are some things you can really tangibly do for yourself in this? Because I know how incredibly challenging this is. And one of the things I like to start with is when I pull siblings, one of the things I often ask them is, have you ever been offered support for yourself related to your siblings' concern? And you can see here, this is 18 and older. So there's two graphs I'll show you. One is 18 plus, one is anyone under the age of 18. So you can see here that the majority of people, and this is not a large sample size, I think I had about like 50 some participants, but you can see here that the majority of those siblings were never offered support. And again, one of the reasons I'm super passionate about this is because I remember my parents being like, we're going to a family session. And I'd be like, was I not invited? Right? So there would be family sessions and the siblings weren't invited. Right? And I think that was so important because there was a piece of me that was like, wait a second, I'm part of this family too, but no one's offering me support. So that shame then came in of like, well, I guess this isn't supposed to be affecting me. So maybe it's something wrong with me that it is affecting me so much, because what the message being sent is that this shouldn't be impacting me, right? Because there's no resources for me as a sibling. So what I did notice with this is that people under the age of 18 have a slightly more, a better opportunity of being offered support. So what that tells me is we're doing a better job. We're not where we need to be because this number should be 100%. But the hope is that the less stigma we have with any disorder, disease that's going on in the family, the more we can treat the entire family and offer support on lots of different ways for other people, including siblings. So some ways you can cope and heal. Attending support groups, and I'm going to talk a little bit in a little bit on a slide about what that looks like, because one of the things that Students Recover and Caron really want to work together to do is to offer a sibling support group, because we know that there's not a lot of them, and I want to make sure that that we have access to that, because I don't think that's something we always have access to. I know that in the substance use disorder, we see a lot of parent and family support groups, but rarely something that says sibling, right? And I've attended family support groups before, and it's very rare that there's other siblings there. It doesn't mean they're not resources. They're phenomenal resources. I know phenomenal people. I've met siblings through that. But find your people. And know that that's what helps works through recovery too, because one of the things I think that's so powerful in this is just seeing people on this Zoom allows me to know that none of us are alone in this. Right? We're not the only ones feeling this way, and that reduces some shame in that too. Find your own treatment, whatever that looks like. I am a huge proponent of counseling. I feel like that was a huge piece for me in my own recovery process of being able to talk through the impact of my brother's substance use disorder on me and my family. From an individual perspective, with someone who did not have a bias one way or the other, who could see the whole picture and allow me to know that how I was feeling was valid. So that last one, verbalizing your feelings, one of the things I didn't realize for a long time was that I could tell people how I was feeling, and that wasn't a bad thing, and that my feelings were valid. Even though I might have felt guilty for them, they were valid. Right. And when I talk with families and parents, one of the things I tell them so often is you need to validate your other children's feelings as well. Right. So if they are angry, if they are resentful, if they are frustrated, those feelings are valid. It is not to say you did anything potentially wrong. They're just their feelings, and they're valid no matter what you're feeling. Setting appropriate boundaries and effectively communicating those boundaries. I know that when my brother has been in different parts, whether that's active addiction, so like early sobriety, long-term sobriety, there have been different boundaries for me with him during those times. I had young children during a relapse for him, and one of my boundaries was that he could not be alone with my children. I valued the safety of my children. I like to base my boundaries on values, because I feel like if I stick to my values, my boundaries make sense. So I would tell my brother a lot, I value the safety of my children above all else. And until we can establish some trust, you can't be alone with my kids. And that has changed over time, because my brother has been able to show me that I can loosen up a little bit of those boundaries. So my boundaries have changed over time, but allowing yourself to set those boundaries. I like to look at boundaries as a fence around your yard. A lot of times we think of boundaries around putting a fence around someone else's yard. So instead of saying to my brother, when you're sober, right, you need to be sober and then you can see my kids, instead of saying, I value the safety of my children, so my children will not be alone with you until, you're clean and sober for this long, or whatever the boundary was. But saying, hey, this is a gate I'm putting around me for my own mental health, my own safety, the safety of my family. I have my husband also is a sibling of a person who struggles with substance use disorder. I always joke my kids did not get great genetics. We know it's on both sides. Unfortunately, my husband's brother is still in an active addiction. His boundary for his brother has been that we do not have contact with his brother. We are here when he's willing and able, and wants to seek recovery, seek sobriety, seek treatment. But until then, our mental health and safety as a family are the most important, which means we don't necessarily have a relationship with him, which is incredibly sad. And was an incredibly challenging boundary for my husband, but one that had to be set, right? So again, allowing yourself to feel those feelings and dismiss some of that shame is really, really important. And setting those boundaries and effectively communicating those boundaries and knowing that they can change and allowing the grace for them to change is also super important. So one of the things I talked about is that we really wanted to kind of use this webinar to first acknowledge the topic, because it's not talked about often. But really our goal with this is, to create a support for siblings. And so what I have here is a QR code. This will take you to basically a landing pad that's just a Google form that you can put your email address in. We're looking towards offering a support group for siblings, potentially starting kind of in the fall. So if that's something you'd be interested in learning more about, scan the QR code with your phone, and you can put your email address in there. It comes to me. I will be a contact point moving forward. But that way, if you're interested in learning about the support group, you're interested in potentially potentially even sharing it with other siblings, things like that, please go ahead and put your email in there. I won't use it for anything other than using it to just keep you up to date on the Students Recover and Caron Sibling Support Group as we move forward with that. So again, I will send this as a PDF, so you will have the QR code in there as well. I'll also put it in the body of the email, the link to the form. So if you're interested in it or don't get it now, we can do. So the last thing I want to end with is this quote. When my family first attended a family therapy session, I walked into the waiting room and was sitting in the waiting room and was so incredibly nervous. I had done my own work at that point, but it was really the first time we were coming together as a family. And this quote was framed sitting on the desk in the waiting room. And so I think of it all the time. So in Japan, broken objects are often repaired with gold. The flaw is seen as a unique piece of the object's history, which adds to its beauty. So to consider this when you feel broken. I think a lot of times we think, we need to mask that and we need to look like it was never broken and we need to make it work. But one of the things I've found for my family in our recovery was that sharing our story and the broken pieces has been so powerful, not only for other people, but for us. And working towards our own recovery to say, we're flawed. There's things in our family that aren't perfect, and that's okay. And it's what makes us the way we are. And it's, for me, I always say it's what makes me the person I am, the professional I am, the parent that I am, the spouse that I am. Is because of this journey I've walked as a sibling and continue to walk as a sibling. And again, I'm privileged to be in the situation that I'm in now with a sibling that's in recovery. I know many people do not have that, that life. And I'm very, very blessed to have that. But I also know that recovery is possible, recovery is probable, and that, if we kind of lean into that and release and be vulnerable, it allows us to not live in as much shame. So I just have some resources here of where I pulled some of the information on how it impacted siblings. And I just want to kind of end here by, you have my email, but I like to have my email up here. And I just want to say thank you for joining us. Thank you for being brave enough to log on this webinar. I know that's not easy. So thank you, and I appreciate it. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to stop recording.